to another episode of Verbal Weekly. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the International Economic Order. If you remember, in the previous episode, we had discussed some political terms, and politics and economy always go together, so it seemed only logical that we discuss some economics in this episode. But unlike the previous episode, we are not going to be introducing too many difficult terms. We are just going to talk about geopolitics in a very, very broad way. Let's get started. Now, when we talk about historical context, it's easy to get carried away and go way back. But we're going to talk about events which are not too far off from this century. So, let's talk about World War II. After the World War, now World War II is the one that I'm talking about, there were two superpowers that emerged. One was the Soviet Union, also known as the USSR, and the second, of course, was the United States of America. Now, these two countries decided that they wanted to form their own camps because these two countries had very different views about how governance and economy should function. So they were so different that they were actually classified as two different worlds. So these two countries started gathering some friends. They forged alliances with other nations, which led to the creation of two camps, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. So what exactly is the Western and the Eastern Bloc? Well, this is what the Western and Eastern blocs look like. Now, if you take a look at this image, you'll see that the Western Bloc primarily consists of the United States, Canada, and quite a few developed countries in Europe. On the other hand, the Eastern Bloc, of course, is the Soviet Union and other communist and socialist states. So, let's define what these blocs were all about. It's not only a geographical difference. It's not just the West and East. These blocs were brought together by treaties that the countries agreed to and signed. For example, most of us have heard of something called Nato. What does Nato stand for? It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this was formed in 1949, not too far off from the Second World War. This was supposed to be an intergovernmental military alliance of about 30 member states. So the agreement was that if one member state was threatened or attacked by someone else, the other countries would come to defend it. But there was something else. It was basically a system of collective security because the West was threatened by the East. So we have to understand that the Soviet Union and the United States wanted to rule the world in very different ways, and both of them were seeking to influence other countries and get them on their side. So of course, the United States and its allies were scared of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union and its allies were scared of the US. So in response to NATO, the Soviet Union decided to do something similar. This was called the Warsaw Pact. Why is it called the Warsaw Pact? Because it was signed in Warsaw, Poland. We have to understand that NATO was formed earlier and the Warsaw Pact was signed a little bit later in 1955. Of course, this was to counter the threat posed by the United States and the NATO allies. So now that we know about the Western and the Eastern blocs, we also need to talk about the Cold War. So what exactly was the Cold War? Did countries actively fight? Not really. The reason it's called the Cold War is that there was no actual warring involved. It was simply a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union and of course their allies. So what happened was that these blocs existed for a long period of time and they used to sponsor what were called proxy wars or regional conflicts. So instead of fighting each other directly, they did it in a pretty roundabout fashion. So the Cold War obviously ended when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and this brought about a major change to the world political and economic order. But we need to move forward in time from there. So let's take a look at what the three worlds model is. So the three worlds model was suggested in the 1950s. This is a very broad classification of countries in terms of their level of development. Now the three worlds model kind of emerged from the Cold War. How is it relevant? The first world was supposed to be the US and its allies. It was the bloc of democratic, capitalist, industrialized countries, which were all, of course, influenced and guided by America. The other thing was that these countries had a very similar political and economic structure. The Other factor was that a lot of these countries, since they had been powerful to begin with, they also exercised influence over a lot of colonies. So these are the previous colonial powers, for example. So now that we've understood what the first world is, let's talk about the second and the third worlds. The second world is really nothing but the Eastern Bloc. And of course, the Eastern Bloc was the Soviet Union and its allies. They also shared other similarities. They had a centrally planned economy. Most of them were single-party states, and most of them were not very high-income countries. They had a medium level of income. And of course, you have the third world. So a lot of times when we hear the word third world, it seems to suggest something inferior. And that's exactly what was wrong with this system of classification. When you rank something as first, second, and third, it automatically suggests that the people or the groups which are first are better than the ones ranked second and third. So we no longer use these terminologies. These have changed. Nevertheless, we do need to understand what the third world really referred to. So the third world actually included all the other countries that were not aligned with either bloc. They did not align with either Russia or the US. So here you might want to explore something called the non-aligned movement, of which India was a founding member. But around that time, all of these countries which did not side with either superpower were called the third world. In other words, these were amongst the least developed countries around that time. Now, the first and the second world were competing to influence the third world countries. So there was a lot going on around that time. This is a map that gives you a broad overview of the countries classified as first world, second world, and third world. So you could probably pause the video here and stare at the map for a bit. Let's move on. Now, what is the current terminology? Because there was a problem with the first, second, and third world. So the current terminology has evolved also from the fact that once the Soviet Union collapsed, the term second world really did not make any sense. It became obsolete. So what is it that we use now? Usually, we use things like developed, developing, and least developed countries. Another way of referring or ranking countries is in terms of high, middle, and low income countries. So now we don't really say first, second, third, we say developed or developing or high income or low income. Now the criteria for classification haven't changed. Income is still the dominant criterion, but the way that we refer to countries has changed. So now we can't really say that someone is a third world country because that might be seen as a bit offensive. So this map now shows you the classification of countries in terms of developed, developing, and the least developed. In case you're wondering what the gray areas are, those are just countries for which data has not been presented here. So that brings us to what is development exactly. So when we call a country developed, is it equal to saying that it's a very rich country with high per capita income, or does it also involve some other criteria? On the whole, economic criteria are the most dominant ones, but let's go into somewhat more detail. So countries can be classified as developed or developing or least developed on the basis of GDP or gross national income, usually take it in per capita terms. The level of industrialization is another criterion. Then we have the general standard of living, and of course, we have the amount of technological infrastructure. These four facets of development are pretty important in classifying a country as developed, developing, or least developed. So now, we would wonder where the idea of classifying countries on the basis of income came from. It seems pretty logical, but actually, there was an influential theory put forward by an American economist, W. Rostow. So what he suggested was that there were 5 stages of economic growth. What were these 5 stages? The first is traditional society. Then there are some preconditions for the takeoff stage. Then there is the takeoff stage. There is the drive to maturity. And then the final stage, which is the age of high mass consumption. Now, what Rostow suggested was that all countries go through the same stages of development, which means that you could not really skip a stage. So let's take a look at these stages in a bit more detail. The traditional society is characterized by limited technology. It does not really change too much. In order to progress from traditional society to the next stage, there has to be a trigger. It cannot be internal change. It has to be an external trigger. Something probably influenced by either a political or a major world event. So once that trigger is there, then we might make the transition to what we call the preconditions for takeoff. So the preconditions for takeoff basically are commercial exploitation of agriculture and extractive industry. Once we're at this stage, we need to take certain actions, for example, installation of physical infrastructure. And once we put in this effort, then we would make the transition to the takeoff stage. So in the takeoff stage, we're looking at developing our manufacturing sector. If the amount of investment in manufacturing exceeds a certain point, for example, according to him, 10% of the national income, then we would move on to the next stage, which is the drive to maturity. And from there, the goal is to reach a stage of high mass consumption. Now, according to Rostow, every country in the world is at one of these stages. If certain actions are taken, that country will make the transition to the next stage. And of course, for every country, the dream is to reach that high mass consumption stage at the very end. A lot of you might be able to see that this theory is wrong or maybe inaccurate in multiple ways. So maybe you could explore a critique of Rostow's theory. One of the things that it has been criticized for is the failure to see that there could be other ways to reach a developed stage. Another problem with the theory is that it takes the US as a model. So let's understand that Rostow was an American economist. He was anti-communist, he was anti-socialist, and therefore he wanted all the other countries to follow the US model of development. And in fact, his theory was also pretty influential in US foreign policy. But now, and even then, a lot of people suggested that his theory could be improved, that there were certain flaws. There could be countries that make the transition from one stage to the next but move no further. There could be countries that skip a stage, for example. It also sees countries which are different or do not follow this model of development as problem countries. So maybe take a look at this theory in a lot more detail. You might also want to look at alternative theories or models of development. You might also want to explore the impact of globalization on the international economic order. So the reason we've kept this video short is that we did not want to introduce too much complexity at one go. So maybe in the next video, we will go a little bit deeper. In the meantime, try and do some reading on your own. All the best.